Imagine waking up tomorrow morning. You turn on the news, and the President of the United States is on every channel. He is not announcing a war. He is not announcing a holiday. He is announcing that you are now a criminal. Not because you stole something, not because you hurt someone, but because of what you own. Because of what is sitting in your safe deposit box or buried in your backyard. Gold. Imagine being told that you have 30 days, just 30 days, to hand over every gold coin, every gold bar, and every gold certificate you own to the Federal Reserve. If you refuse, you face 10 years in prison and a fine that would bankrupt your family twice over. It sounds like fiction. It sounds like something from a dystopian novel about a collapsing dictatorship. It sounds impossible in the land of the free. But it happened. Here, in the United States of America. The year was 1933. The month was April. The president was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the weapon he used was Executive Order 6102. Historians call it monetary policy. Economists call it stabilization. But to the millions of Americans who lived through it, to the people who saw their life savings vanish into the government vaults, it was something else entirely. It was a heist. The Great Gold Heist of 1933. To understand why this happened, we have to go back to the moments before the order was signed. We have to understand the panic, the fear, the total collapse of trust. March 1933. America was not just in a depression, it was dying. The stock market had crashed 4 years earlier, but the real pain was happening on Main Street. Unemployment was 25%. Think about that. 1 in every 4 men walking the streets with no work and no hope. But the scary part wasn't the unemployment. It was the banks. People didn't trust the banks anymore. They had seen too many of them close their doors. They had seen their neighbors lose everything. So, they did the only logical thing. They panicked. They ran to the banks, not to put money in, but to take it out. They demanded their deposits, and they didn't want paper money. Paper could become worthless. They wanted something real. They wanted gold. Millions of Americans, hoarding gold coins under their mattresses, hiding gold bars in their basements. It was a run on the bank of biblical proportions. The banking system was bleeding to death. The Federal Reserve's gold vaults were emptying out. The government was terrified. They were facing a total collapse of the United States financial system. When FDR took the oath of office on March 4th, the country was hours away from anarchy. Governors were closing banks in 32 states just to stop the bleeding. The machine had stopped. So, FDR did something unprecedented. He declared a bank holiday. He shut down every single bank in the country. For an entire week, no one could get their money. The economy froze. And in that silence, in that week of fear and uncertainty, the government came up with a plan, a radical plan, a plan to save the government by sacrificing the saver. They decided that the problem wasn't the debt. The problem wasn't the spending. The problem was you. The problem was that you held the gold. And as long as you held the gold, the government couldn't print the money it needed to spend its way out of the crisis. So, they came for it. They didn't ask politely, they demanded it. They made patriotism synonymous with confiscation. They told you that holding gold was hoarding. They told you that protecting your family's wealth was an act against the state. And the saddest part? Most people obeyed. They lined up. They handed over the only real wealth they had. They traded their gold for paper dollars. They trusted their president. They believed him when he said it was for the greater good. They didn't know that they were walking into a trap, a financial trap that was about to snap shut and destroy 40% of their wealth overnight. Today, we are going to reopen this case file. We are going to look at the numbers. We are going to expose the mechanism of the heist. And we are going to answer the question that every modern investor needs to ask. With national debt hitting $37 trillion, with the banks looking shaky again, with the government desperate for cash, Could it happen? Again? To understand the heist, you have to understand the motive. Why would a democratic government declare war on its own currency? Why would they betray the very people who voted for them? The answer is debt. But not just debt. It was a specific kind of economic nightmare that makes debt impossible to pay. Deflation. We are used to fearing inflation when prices go up. But in 1933, America was being strangled by the opposite. Prices were falling, and they were falling fast. Now, to the average person, lower prices sound good. Cheaper bread, cheaper gas, cheaper clothes. Who wouldn't want that? But to a person with debt, deflation is a death sentence. Let me explain the trap. The trap that millions of Americans and the government itself were caught in. Imagine you are a farmer in Iowa in 1920. You borrow money to buy land. When you take out the loan, a bushel of corn sells for $2. You calculate that you need to grow 1,000 bushels to pay your mortgage payment. It seems fair, but then deflation hits. The price of corn crashes. By 1932, that same bushel of corn is selling for only 30 cents. Suddenly, your debt hasn't changed in dollars, but the real cost of that debt has exploded. You now have to grow 6 times as much corn just to make the same payment. It was mathematically impossible. Across the country, farmers were burning their corn for heat because it was cheaper than coal. They were letting crops rot in the fields because it cost more to harvest them than they could sell them for. Mortgages were going unpaid. Banks were foreclosing on farms. But the banks couldn't sell the land because no one had any money. So the banks failed. And when the banks failed, people lost their savings. And when people lost their savings, they stopped spending, which made prices fall even further. It was a deflationary spiral, a whirlpool, sucking the entire American economy down into the abyss. And at the center of this spiral was the United States government. The government had massive debts from World War I, and just like the farmer, as the dollar became stronger and stronger, as prices fell lower and lower, the government's debt became harder and harder to pay. FDR looked at the numbers. He saw a nation of debtors being crushed by a currency that was too valuable. He realized something terrifying. He couldn't save the economy unless he destroyed the dollar. He needed inflation. He needed to make prices go up. He needed to make the dollar worth less, so that farmers could pay their debts, so that factories could open, so that the government wouldn't go bankrupt. But there was one thing standing in his way, one massive golden obstacle: the gold standard. The law said that for every dollar printed, there had to be gold in the vault to back it up. 40 cents of gold for every paper dollar. This was the golden handcuff. FDR wanted to print money to stop the deflation. He wanted to flood the system with cash, but he couldn't, because he didn't have enough gold. If he printed more dollars, people would run to the bank and demand the gold backing them. The treasury would be drained in a week. The game would be over. FDR was trapped. He was in a box built by the laws of sound money. The smart economists, the bankers on Wall Street, they told him to do nothing. They said, liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers. They said the market would fix itself. They said the gold standard was sacred, more sacred than the people suffering in the breadlines. But FDR was not a banker. He was a politician, and he saw a revolution brewing. He saw angry men marching in the streets. He saw the threat of communism rising. He knew he had to break the handcuffs. He had to break the gold standard. But he couldn't just announce it. If he announced it, everyone would rush to hoard gold before the dollar crashed. The wealth would hide. The capital would flee the country. He needed to trap the wealth inside the system. He needed to make sure that when he devalued the dollar, the profit went to the government, not to you. So, he devised a plan to nationalize the profit of inflation, to take the one asset that protected the people from the government and turn it into a weapon for the state. He couldn't let you keep your gold, because if you kept your gold, You would be safe from his inflation. You would be independent. And in 1933, independence was not an option. So, how do you steal the wealth of an entire nation without calling it theft? You do it by making honesty illegal. Step 1 was the confiscation. Executive Order 6102, April 5, 1933. The order was simple. It demanded that all persons are required to deliver on or before May 1, 1933, all gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates now owned by them to a Federal Reserve Bank. The penalty for disobeying? A $10,000 fine and 10 years in prison. Think about that. 10 years in prison for the crime of owning money. Patriotic Americans lined up at the banks. They were scared. They handed over their life savings, their coins, their bullion. They traded hard assets for paper dollars. But not everyone obeyed. There was one man who stood up. One man who looked at the president's order and said, no. His name was Frederick Barber Campbell. He wasn't a radical. He wasn't a revolutionary. He was a lawyer, a wealthy Manhattan attorney. And he understood the Constitution better than the politicians. Campbell had deposited 27 gold bars at Chase National Bank. That is about 5,000 ounces. A fortune. When the deadline passed, Campbell walked into the bank. He didn't turn his gold in. He demanded to withdraw it. The bank refused. They said they had to follow the president's order. So Campbell did the unthinkable. He sued the bank. And he sued the United States government. He argued that the executive order was unconstitutional. He argued that under the Fifth Amendment, the government cannot take private property for public use without just compensation. And paying him in paper dollars, which the government was planning to devalue, was not just compensation. The government was terrified. If Campbell won, the whole plan would collapse. Every citizen would demand their gold back. The heist would fail. So, the government attacked him. They indicted Campbell. They tried to put him in prison. They turned the full weight of the Department of Justice against one citizen. It was a legal battle for the soul of American property rights. But then, something strange happened. Just before the case went to the Supreme Court, the government dropped the criminal charges, suddenly, quietly. Why? Because they knew they might lose. And they couldn't risk a court ruling saying the confiscation was illegal before they had finished the theft. They let Campbell go, but they kept his gold. They confiscated it anyway. They denied him his property rights, not by winning in court, but by changing the rules of the game. And once Campbell was silenced, once the gold was secured in the vaults, once the resistance was broken, FDR moved to step 2, the magic trick. It was January 1934. The Gold Reserve Act was passed. With the stroke of a pen, FDR officially changed the price of gold. For 50 years, gold had been $20.67 an ounce. That was the price the government paid you when they took your gold. But now, the new price was set at $35 an ounce. Do the math. The government bought your gold for $20. And then, the moment it was in their possession, they declared it was worth $35. Instantly, overnight, the government made a profit of almost 70% on gold that used to be yours. In accounting terms, they created $2.8 billion of profit out of thin air. That is equivalent to about $60 billion today, just by changing a number on a ledger. They used that profit to fund a slush fund called the Exchange Stabilization Fund, a fund that allowed the Treasury to manipulate the dollar without congressional approval. It was brilliant, it was devious, and it was absolute theft. They bought low, by force, and they sold high, by decree. The government cleared its balance sheet. They saved the system. They saved the banks. But the people? The people who followed the rules? The people who held those paper dollars in their hands? They were about to find out what saving the system really cost. The government cleared its balance sheet. They saved the banks. They declared victory over the Depression. But the people? The people who followed the rules? The people who stood in line and handed over their gold? They were decimated. This is the part of the story that the history books gloss over. They call it monetary policy. They call it necessary stimulus. But for the average saver, it was a catastrophe. It was the invisible theft. Let's look at the math, because the math doesn't lie. Imagine you were a prudent man in 1932. You worked hard. You saved $1,000. In 1932, that $1,000 could buy you about 50 ounces of gold. That was your real wealth. 50 ounces of hard assets. Then came the confiscation. You obeyed the law. You exchanged your gold for 1,000 paper dollars. Then came the revaluation. The government changed the price of gold to $35. Now, you try to buy your gold back. But your 1,000 paper dollars can no longer buy 50 ounces. Now, it can only buy 28 ounces. Where did the other 22 ounces go? Who took them? No one broke into your house. No one pointed a gun at you in an alley. The government took them. They took 40% of your purchasing power without ever sending you a tax bill. This is the magic of devaluation. It transfers wealth from the saver to the debtor. And since the government is always the biggest debtor, the government always wins. But the damage went deeper than just the numbers. The Great Gold Heist of 1933 fundamentally changed the nature of money itself. Before 1933, a dollar bill was a contract. If you look at an old bill, it says, "We'll pay to the bearer on demand, $1 in gold." It was a receipt, a claim check, like a ticket for a coat check. The paper wasn't the value. The paper was proof that you owned the value inside the vault. But after 1933, take a look at a modern dollar bill or a bill from 1934. That promise is gone. Now it says Federal Reserve Note. What is a note? A note is a debt. It is an IOU. It is a promise to pay. Nothing. In 1933, FDR cut the tie between the people and the gold. He created fiat money. Money by decree. Money that is worth something only because the government says it is worth something, and because they force you to use it for taxes. This was the moment the discipline broke. When money was gold, the government had to be careful. They couldn't spend what they didn't have. If they printed too much paper, people would notice. But with fiat money, the only limit is how fast the printing press can run. Since 1933, the US dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power relative to gold. 98%. That isn't an accident. That is the design of the system built by FDR. The profit they made from the gold heist, the $2.8 billion, it was just the beginning. It opened the door to the deficits, to the national debt, to the inflation that we see today. It taught politicians a dangerous lesson. It taught them that if they ever get into trouble, if they ever promise too much, if they ever borrow more than they can pay back, they don't have to default. They don't have to admit failure. They can simply change the rules. They can simply change the price of money. For the government, it was a new deal. But for the American saver, it was the end of an era, the end of honest money. And the scary part? Once they tasted that power, they never gave it back. The emergency measures of 1933 became the permanent system of today. And now, 90 years later, we are staring at the same trap. The debt is unpayable. The system is fragile. And the government needs a way out. They can't confiscate the gold again. It's too hard. It's too dispersed. So, what will they confiscate this time? Fast forward to today. Look at the numbers. They are flashing red. The United States national debt has crossed $37 trillion. If you count unfunded liabilities, Social Security, Medicare, the real number is over 100 trillion. Does it sound familiar? The trap is the same. The debt is unpayable. Mathematically, unpayable. We are back in 1933, but the numbers are bigger, and the stakes are higher. The government is cornered again. They need a way out. They need to erase the debt. And history tells us they will not choose austerity. They will not choose to cut their own power. They will choose to reach into your pocket again. But this time, it will be different. In 1933, the heist was physical. They had to send agents to banks. They had to physically melt down coins. It was messy. It was difficult. And there is too much gold hidden in private hands today to ever confiscate it all again. So, how do you confiscate wealth in the 21st century? How do you seize control of the currency without kicking down doors? You do it digitally. Enter the concept of the central bank digital currency, CBDC. They will sell it to you as convenience. They will tell you it is modern. They will tell you it is safe. Just like FDR told you that handing over your gold was patriotic. But look closer. A CBDC is not just digital money. It is programmable money. In 1933, once you handed over your gold, you were trapped in the dollar. You couldn't escape the devaluation. With a CBDC, the trap is built into the code. Imagine a currency that the government can turn off if you spend it on the wrong things. Imagine a currency with an expiration date. Stimulus money that disappears if you don't spend it fast enough. Or imagine negative interest rates, where the government simply deducts a tax directly from your savings account every single night to encourage spending. That is not money. That is a control grid. That is Executive Order 6102 on steroids. It solves the government's problem perfectly. If they need to erase the debt, they can simply devalue the digital unit. If they need to stop a bank run, they can simply turn off your ability to withdraw. No need for a bank holiday, just a button. The mechanism changes, the technology evolves, but the intent stays exactly the same. The government must survive, and if the price of survival is the destruction of your savings, they will pay it, gladly. This is the lesson of 1933, and it is the warning for 2025. So, what can you do? How does a sage protect himself? FDR showed us the answer, by showing us what he was afraid of. He was afraid of independence. He was afraid of assets that he could not print and could not control. He confiscated the gold because gold is the enemy of the printing press. He attacked private property because private property is the only shield against the state. The lesson is not to hide in fear. The lesson is to diversify, to hold assets that exist outside of the system, assets that are real, whether it is land, whether it is commodities, or whether it is the history books that teach you the truth. Do not rely on their promises. Do not rely on their paper. And be very, very careful when they ask you to trade your freedom for a digital wallet. History is a circle. The great gold heist happened once. The conditions are ripe for it to happen again. But this time, you know the playbook. You know the signs. And you know that when the government says, "Trust us," it is time to check the lock on your safe. This is Fiscal Folklore. We tell these stories not to scare you, but to arm you, because knowledge is the only wealth that can never be confiscated. If you believe that the past is the key to the future, then you have found your place. Join us